Today we're talking super heavy vehicles and gargantuan monstrous creatures. Let's talk about some of the most massive units in 40k and how effective they are on the field. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be fun to talk super heavies. Maybe not quite as common a sight in 40k as they were in 8th edition, and maybe a unit that Games Workshop is always going to have a bit of difficulty balancing right. In the video we'll talk briefly about super heavy vehicles in 9th edition, what challenges they have and what advantages they get, then talk through some of the strongest super heavies for every faction, and finish up with what I'd argue to be some of the top 4 super heavies in the game right now. Plenty to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. Back in 40k's past, super heavies just weren't really a thing in standard games whatsoever, and I kind of feel that even in 8th and 9th edition, Games Workshop does kind of generally try and keep them somewhat niche. I don't think they want the vast majority of the best armies in the game just to be 3 enormous Lord of War trying to duke it out with each other. So often I feel if any one super heavy gets really strong for one faction, it often gets points adjustments. Maybe the only faction that they're really kind of committed to supporting and making somewhat good are Imperial and Chaos Knights. They have made themselves an entire faction of super heavy walkers, so there's some onus on them to make them at least somewhat playable. In general though, as I'm sure a lot of people are easily aware by now, 9th edition really has a lot of big issues for super heavies. They're slightly painful to field for one. Your first super heavy auxiliary is a bit cheaper now, only 1 CP to include 1, provided it's the same faction as your warlord. Maybe not the biggest tax on that one, but it doesn't get specific detachment special rules, things like say Tau Sept Tenets, or Space Marine Chapter Tactics. Otherwise, unless you're Imperial Knights, it's a frankly enormous 6 CP for a big super heavy detachment with 3 to 5 of them. Basically, if you are committing to that many big heavy things, you are paying quite a hefty tax for doing so. That's genuinely going to be a lot less options in game, options that could lead you to big swings and maybe killing enemy units. Otherwise, super heavies really hate terrain, and 9th edition is the one that's really taken terrain quite seriously. They don't get dense cover, they can't be obscured by obscuring terrain. Denser boards mean movement lanes are a bit more choked, and particularly with the obscuring terrain thing, you might be able to get into a situation where the enemy can shoot you, but you can't shoot them. Not exactly a good thing for winning a firefight. Otherwise, they have a big wound profile that's particularly weak to high damage weapons, things like the new Tower Hammerhead and Storm Surge, and potentially can be punished on secondaries as well. Titan Hunters and Bring It Down both exist, and can be effective against things like Knights, and generally committing to quite a lot of super heavies might make you struggle for other secondaries. For the downsides though, there are a few positives. They can fall back and shoot and cast psychic powers if they have any. Don't suffer from difficult terrain, so that's one terrain positive I suppose. Having an enormous model means that they're almost always one of the best places to spend stratagems that you can, command rerolls, combat interrupts, or Overwatch being good examples, and sometimes just the sheer mass effect can be a bit intimidating. If your opponent isn't able to take out the entire thing, then they could waste an entire shooting phase shooting one and not killing it, and that could put them significantly behind. Finally, they are quite a good target for the last secondary, a slightly easier place than most to keep that 5 VP safe. In general though, as a class, I feel like their main negatives outweigh the positives, and they have to be really quite efficient units if they are going to break through. As I alluded to in the thumbnail, perhaps the Baneblade was initially somewhat balanced against the Lehman Russ. The points costs were kind of similar before for how much value you got out of them, but it just really hasn't received as much support as some of the more core units of the Codex like the Lehman Russ. Now it basically doesn't really even compete with standard Lehman Russ demolishers between their good damage output and 2+ save, and really the only main advantages of taking a Baneblade over a standard battle tank are that it's a bit more resistant to being locked up by enemies and has a bit of melee with its tracks. Just seems like a good example of a super heavy, where Games Workshop really hasn't made any effort to make it comparable with its standard pattern alternative. When it costs more CP, doesn't get a regimental trait, and interacts worse with terrain, that kind of puts the nail in the coffin. That's not to say though that there aren't at least some effective super heavies out there. Before we get into the top 4, here are a few honourable mentions, maybe some of the stronger ones out of each of these factions. For the Space Marines, the Primaris super heavy Astrius might be one of the more efficient choices. Realistically, its firepower and defense isn't really going to equate to a trio of Redemptor Dreadnoughts which you can buff with other things, and they do cost about the same amount of points as well, as the Astrius is 600 points. That investment gives you a 2+ save toughness 8 super heavy with a couple of void shields, a fairly general purpose main gun, and a couple of pretty powerful plasma sponsons. In general, I don't think it's usually ever going to be an optimal choice for Space Marines to field one, but could be quite fun to put on the table with Iron Hands. You can do some quite fun things with them, such as boost its save, or massively increase its firepower, and 1 CP to keep it in Devastator Doctrine each turn really isn't too bad, getting the extra AP and reroll ones to hit. For the guard, despite the Baneblade and its variants being fairly underwhelming as I already mentioned, I still feel that they're better than quite a lot of the other guard super heavies, which just really aren't very points efficient whatsoever. Most of the variants are kind of various different degrees of okay. Maybe the Shadow Sword is the one that sticks out one of the most though, as it is actually genuinely fairly efficient against enemy super heavies. So if the meta changed and people were bringing say loads of Storm Surges or Monoliths or something, it might not actually be the worst for trying to bust a few of them with that big 2d6 damage. It gets +1 to hit against Titanics and also rerolls failed wound rolls against them. Even then though, and against those specific targets, it's still going to be struggling to compete with Demolisher tank commanders. For Orcs, perhaps my favourite super heavies are either the Kill Tank or the Gorkanaut or Morkanaut. The Kill Tank was kind of popular pre-Codex. At the moment it's either 275 points with a Giga Shooter or 325 with a big Burster Cannon. With that gun equipped it averages 5 or 6 strength 10 hits at close range, as it gets a +1 to hit, so hitting on force. It's fairly tough with 24 wounds at toughness 8 and a 3+ save, and has a bit of transport capacity as well, and even fights in melee okay as well, though the AP is only -1 with that ram. I think it's fairly close in power to things like the Gorkanaut and Morkanaut, which do cost a bit more, have basically the same defensive profile, but significantly better melee. For Necrons, out of the Titanic choices, probably the Monolith is the most competitive I think. It's only 330 points post the reductions, though seeing as quite a lot of other decent stuff went down as well, I still don't think it's going to be a top pick for Necrons. For the right list though, I do feel that multiple Monoliths could actually be really quite annoying. They really do put quite a lot of toughness 8 2+ save wounds on the table for the cost, have fairly decent anti-armor with the Death Rays and Particle Whip, reasonable melee with that Portal of Exile, and that nice stratagem to allow you to get units in very close out of reserve. Could potentially allow some very short charges if you're lucky. For the Craft Worlds, their codex is just around the corner, but as their Forge World units aren't desperately strong, I have a very hard time imagining that the Wraith Knight isn't probably going to be the strongest choice after it drops. It's rumoured to be around about 460 points, so a bit more equivalent to Imperial Knights. Seems to be getting -1 damage inbuilt like the rest of the other Wraith units, and then either gets the choice between a damage D3+6 Wraith Cannon, or the Sword and Shield version that gives it a 4+ invul, and some really quite enormous melee. Perhaps a bit pointless to speculate though it'll be interesting to look at when the codex comes out. Finally, for the Demons, Death Guard and Thousand Sons, they don't really have super heavies of their own. Mortarion, Magnus, and the big greater demons that you get in the Forge World book, none of those are actually Titanic, though of course are still enormous threats on the table. Out of those, I feel that Magnus is just a bit fragile and a bit easier to get gunned off the table. Mortarion is at least somewhat hard to take down. He was almost problematically strong when the codex first dropped, but then has rapidly been crept out by other releases. And out of the big greater demons, that Slanesh one Zarakainel gets some play. Basically a really big exalted keeper of secrets that can do a whole load of mortal wounds with its melee attacks. Moving on though, let's get into my top 4 favourites, maybe some of the ones that are going to be most commonly seen on the tabletop. In general, out of super heavies, Imperial and Chaos Knights really have quite a lot of reasonable options. The standard Questor pattern variants from both codexes are both good. Castellans and Valiants have both been seeing a bit of play out of the Imperial Knights, though despite its recent small nerf, I do feel that the Questor Megara is perhaps one of the most interesting. It's up to 500 points now from 480, so that does take the shine off a little bit, but it's not the biggest change, and it remains all-round strong. It's got the standard Questor pattern profile, but then has really quite a lot of advantages over the Codex Knights. It gets its 5+ invul and melee, which is a really big deal. A lot of the things that most efficiently kill Knights are close combat, and interestingly the Loyalist Imperial Knights get to rotate Ion Shields in close combat, though Chaos do not. Getting a 4+ invul on something this big can be the difference between life and death. The shooting's really quite generalist, 8 strength 7 AP -2 damage 3 attacks with exploding 6s from that lightning cannon, plus a couple of backup weapons including a fairly fearsome rag cleanser for when you get up close. All of them ignore cover as well, which is also handy. Perhaps the single best thing about this though is its great melee. For heavy targets you get 4 attacks at strength 16, AP -4 and damage 6, going to damage 8 against vehicles and monsters, but against most anything else you've got 12 attacks at strength 8, AP -2, damage 3. There aren't a lot of squads in the game that are going to happily eat those kind of attacks and not take a fair few casualties. Army-wise, Knights really do support their super heavies quite well. Useful things like rotate Ion Shields, Machine Spirit Resurgent for the Loyalists, the possibility of auto-exploding or fighting in death. Imperial and Chaos Knights both do objectives a lot better than they used to, now these big boys count as 10 models. The Chaos Knights can get extra attacks and extra AP on the charge from Iconoclast, and on the Loyalist side, House Crast is quite a good combo with this guy. Rerolling hits in combat for all of those mighty melee attacks, the Headsman's Mark for extra damage against vehicles and monsters, and First Knight for more rerolls at range. Overall, I don't really think that this guy is enormously above the other knights on offer, but he's certainly a really good example of what they can do. Next up, I thought we'd take a look at the Khorne Lord of Skulls, the Chaos Space Marine Super Heavy, and for one of the weakest factions in the game, it is one of their more interesting units, and perhaps one of the best ways where they can leverage all of their crazy amount of buffs to get loads of damage out of one huge unit. Again, it also took one tiny nerf in Chapter Approved, though at 480 points I wouldn't say it's really much worse than it was before. Maybe the raw stats aren't really the biggest thing that make the Lord of Skulls good, it's more the buffs that it can get. In general it seems at least fairly in line with most Imperial Knights, a little slower, a few more wounds. I have made a small typo there, he is only strength 10. Though the times 2 strength of the cleaver does make him a strength 20 effectively if he wants to be going on that profile. I think it's really quite fun that his attacks actually degrade upwards. It means they'll be swinging with a big 8 attacks when he's on his lowest bracket, a number that would certainly make Khorne proud. His shooting is kind of okay general purpose, 12 shots at strength 8, AP-2, damage 2, then backed up by a smaller secondary gun of your choice, and his melee is kind of comparable to a knight. The chain axe does hit a bit harder though, at higher strength than AP-4. As I said though, the good stuff really is the buffs for this guy. The Demon Forge stratagem is almost an auto-use every single turn, you get to reroll all hits and wounds for his attacks, absolutely crazy for 1 CP on a super heavy, easily justifiable whether or not he's shooting or fighting in combat. I think one of the main reasons that he's good is that Chaos doesn't have the core keyword, so he can use carry to auras and things. If you want to try and save the CP a bit, he could use Abaddon or Khan to get full rerolls to hit, and despite being Khorne, he can be well supported by psychic powers such as Warp Time, Master of Possession buffs including a 4+ invul and rerolls, or even Dark Apostle prayers. He's probably strongest in the Iron Warriors overall though, getting 1 command point to heal 3 wounds when he needs it, and can make good use of that Warlord trait that gives him exploding 6s to hit. Overall certainly a helpful unit that can shore up Chaos lists, and one that I'm not certain would necessarily get much stronger with a new codex, losing access to a lot of the cylinders that he can put on him. Next up we have the Tyranid Harridan, a 700 point Titanic flyer, and I must admit will be a pretty intimidating threat to see on the other side of the board. The Harridan moves 45 inches, so you're unlikely to be able to hide from it if it's in flight mode. Hits on 3s, has strength and toughness 8, a huge 34 wounds, 5 attacks, leadership 9 and a 3+ save, and if and when it wants to fight in combat, it's got a hover mode where you can move 20 inches and then still charge. Easily could give you a turn 1 charge with enormous melee if you want it. Compared with most of the other super heavies, it's just enormously fast. You're really going to struggle to ignore this thing, and particularly so with the amount of damage it can mete out. In combat, it'll do 5 attacks at strength 10, AP-3 and a big damage 6, re-rolling 1s to hit, and at range those dire bio cannons put out 16 shots at strength 10, AP-3 and damage 3, each one of them giving you a pretty decent chance of just ending a major threat in 1 round of shooting. It's not enormously strong against hordes, it's going to struggle to clear mass infantry, particularly in later stages of the game, but it does seem fairly efficient against large targets, particularly as it kind of puts your opponent in a difficult choice. Do they try and kill the Harridan with its massive 34 wounds? Because if they focus all their guns on it and they don't quite manage, then you're both going to have it to deal with as well as the rest of the Tyranid army that you've ignored. It can access some decent stratagems as well, 1 command point to reroll all wounds in melee, 2 command points to get +1 damage on that shooting, getting damage 4 bio cannons if it wants. You can use an adaptive physiology on it, 1 CP for a 5+ invul or murderous size on its combat weapons, or it can potentially get that 5+ invul from the Crusher Stampede, as well as picking up -1 damage, and that crazy mortal wound stratagem where it's almost certainly going to deal out 6 mortal wounds for 1 CP. Leviathan can also help it out a bit as well, redeploying via a Warlord trait for the optimum alpha strike, and a few other fun options. Obviously an enormous points investment, it's making up over a third of your army, but does seem to be one of the super heavies that's efficient enough to get the nod. Finally, lastly, and perhaps most intimidating of all at the moment, is the Tau Storm Surge, which I did cover in its own video recently on the channel, so feel free to search that up if you'd like. In brief though, in one of the more common loadouts, it'll be 345 points, moves kind of slowly at 8 inches, and has strength and toughness 8, 22 wounds, 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and point for point I think it might be the single most durable Lord of War that we've looked at out of any of these. I must admit I wasn't expecting this thing to both get a 2+ save and a 4+ invul on the same thing. I thought Games Workshop would have gone for one or the other. While it perhaps doesn't outcompete gunline broadsides with core, Its firepower is still very efficient indeed. 2 strength 16 AP-4 damage 12 shots at 24 inches with the blast cannon, plus a whole bunch of secondary weapons for clearing chaff, several of which can fire out of line of sight. It natively ignores light cover. It can really cheaply acquire ballistic skill 3+ with a marker light from somewhere. If it doesn't move, it can use stabilizing anchors to re-roll all hit rolls as well, for a fantastic amount of firepower overall. And even then it has a few more support systems, things like counter-fire defense systems, velocity trackers, or early warning overrides. From within the Tau Codex, Montcar can allow for quite fast movement while firing accurately. It basically allows you to advance and shoot at no penalty for the first few turns, so in reality a lot of the time it is going to have d6 inches plus 8. If you're running it in the Boar concept, then for 2 CP that massive pulse cannon can ignore invuls, pretty much a death knell to knights, and it does have a couple of really handy extra support things, 1 CP to fire on full profile, and the potential to tank hits on drone savior protocols, which could save it a really mighty blow. Tau Sept could perhaps be kind of interesting as well, getting some reroll hits if you're taking 3 of them, and maybe Shadow Sun redeploying one via her pre-game redeployment thing could be quite good for getting the right positioning on the enemy. It's not without some weaknesses, namely all the ones for super heavies plus not the greatest melee, but I think it's certainly in strong competition for one of the strongest super heavy units in the entire game right now. So I think we'll leave it there for our review of super heavies in 9th edition then. As always, if you think that I've underrated or overestimated any units, please let me know down in the comments below. I know we certainly could have talked about a fair few more Imperial Knights, but I wanted to try and look at really quite a lot of armies and not just make it into a Knights video. If you've enjoyed the reviews, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will generally try and keep 40k videos coming out most days, hopefully including a fair few rundowns like this one. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, any support on the channel's Patreon page is enormously appreciated. Making all these videos does take a fair amount of time and effort. If you'd like to give it a look, the link's down in the video description. I do try and give channel Patreons a few decent rewards, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.